You're going to get all of your fabrics, and then you're going to get this little gift from me. And if you had watched my Easy Sunday, not my Easy Sunday, Modern Trip Around the World, when I started that webinar, I talked about using an interface grid. And so this is a sample of a panel interface grid, which is different from the sample that I gave you in that kit for the Modern Trip Around the World. This is a 2.5-inch grid sample of panels, and the other one was like yardage. So let's talk about this real quick, because I believe you're going to be able to do the bright squares, quilt, or any type of, patterned, small print, small half square triangle, beautiful quilts in hours versus weeks. And I think you're going to be stunned by that. So some of you guys already know what I'm going to say, but just bear with me. This is Basel, and this happens to come in the full width, 44 inches wide. Now I have just a small piece right here cut, okay? But let me show you what the Basel version of this looks like. So here it is. I've taken it off of the bolt, and you can see here that it is just like fabric, very wide, okay? So it comes on the bolt. This is folded in half. This is the 44 inches wide, 48 inches, something like that. And it has the squares with dashes marked on it. One side is very soft, and one side has the interface grid on it. So what's really cool about this stuff, it's hard to find. It's not something you're going to be able to find except at like your local quilt shop, someone who actually does a technique that we call watercolor collage. So watercolor collaging uses this fabric. And the gal that invented that technique came out initially with a grid, and that is the gift that I'm giving you, which is different. When she first came out with this idea called watercolor collaging, she has panels. So here you go. Here's a panel of this right here. And it's approximately 27 inches for panels, okay? The nice thing about this is it's a little more durable. It's a little bit more durable than the Basel. It is a little more expensive. You will need 2 of these panels to make a left and right section of that, well, let's call it a quadrant of the bright squares. So you will need a left and a right put together to make a quadrant. There's 6 quadrants: top, left, top right, middle left, middle right, bottom left, bottom right. And each one of them take 2. So I'm giving you a sample of this, which is different than the sample I gave you in the other kits. You can try them both. I like this a lot, and if it takes 2 panels, it's a lot easier to manage when you're designing because these are big quadrants, and it's all you have to do is sew them together, and you're going to be sewing them together anyway when you sew all of your quadrants together. So that's the difference between the Quilter's Grid product that you're getting now versus the Basel grid interface you got before. Both are for sale at Petting Fabric, so you can choose which one you want. You'll want to look for the 2.5-inch grid, and that's going to get you the base to designing your quilt. So you guys can follow the pattern for the bright squares. I don't need to teach you that particular pattern, plus it's a private pattern, and obviously it's cutting strips and sewing them together and really paying attention to the sequence of it. What I want to do is I want to teach you how to plan your quilt ahead, how to lay it out, how to use this product, and possibly even how to think through doing a different quilt whether it be bright squares from Case and his fabrics, or whether it be smaller pieces, even half square triangle pieces that are 1 inch. With an interface grid, you've got a 1 inch, a 2 inch, and a 2.5 inch that you can put together a bazillion little pieces of squares in hours rather than weeks, okay? So now some of you guys sat through this before, which was a short, brief review of a pillow that I did for the Modern Trip Around the World. This is a more in-depth look of how to use this product and how to sew massive squares in short periods of time. So let's talk about the technique first, and then we're going to talk about the design and the layout and how to lay this out. Now I'm going to stand up and I'm going to hold up my ironing board. And if you guys do not have a tabletop ironing board, that's fine. For all you newbies that didn't know, aren't familiar with me from last year, I have a really great webinar at YouTube that teaches you how to make a tabletop ironing board. And all you need is staple gun, you need some really good felt, and you need some batting and some fabric to do this. And you need to make sure your board is thick. You don't want to get a flimsy board, because as you press, you want to make sure that the moisture from your iron is absorbed in the board, and if it's too thin, it will warp. So this is my board, and I love this board for this project because it's wide enough that I can do a whole half a quadrant. So now this is not the Case pattern. It is the Case fabrics that are in the pattern, but I'm not going to expose the pattern in tonight's session. I changed it up just for this webinar. Okay, so a couple things to know. This is half of the quadrant, okay, and this is the left half, and then I can put the right half on here. But what you need to do when you're using this product is you need to think through your color schemes. And what's really great about doing quilting this way is that, have you ever sewn something together and then you step back and you look at it and you go, okay, I hate that. That's awful. That's the ugliest thing I've ever seen. Why did I sew that together? What was I thinking? Well, you don't actually have to sew it together to see that simulation. Here you can cut your pieces, put them down, lay out your grid, walk away from it, take a photo, and come back to it. And it's no big deal. Okay? And that's what I really love about this. I am going to make some quadrants between now and next week that follow the pattern exactly, which the quilt is on the World Wide Web, so we all know what the quilt looks like. But I'm also going to design this particular quilt in a Easter quilt top. That's how easy you're going to see from this week to next week how simple I can get, as busy as I am, kitting and shipping and doing all this other stuff, how I can get this done, so can you, okay? And no, Colleen Harris is not going to sew it for me. I'm going to sew it, so you're going to see that. And Serena, I hope you're watching too, because I'm going to do it myself, but I'm going to make the time because it's that easy. Now let's talk about the technique first. When you cut your squares, and I did cheat, there is this wonderful Cutter Go template that I purchased, and it's the square 2.5 inch, and I use that to cut out all of my squares to save myself some time, okay, and that was a great little purchase here. Love this, saves me a ton of time there. You know, and what we've learned is you don't really waste fabric, because that fabric that is left over is great scrappy quilts that Susan Bellinger has been making for our charity quilts. So set those scraps aside. You can use them. So now once you get your squares cut and you make your little piles over here of your squares that you're going to be using, start laying out your design. Now one thing that I'm going to recommend to you is pay attention. If you need help, pay attention to how Case does it. He has 23 fabrics. He repeats color depths in different prints. So what we see Case doing is now what Tula's doing, if you guys watch the Tula wall, is having some staples in his line, which he calls classics, which are his spots, milfoil, and guinea flower, and also Aboriginal dot. So we see those four all the time, repeated in different colorways. And in this quilt, you have three of those. You've got the Aboriginal dot, you've got the spot, and the milfoil that have been, and I think Roman glass. So he's using the four, and he's repeating his classics in pattern prints, but in different colorways. So now all I've done is randomly set up a pattern here, and just to show you the technique. But if you want to make an Easter quilt, or let's say you want to make a Valentine quilt, or a Christmas quilt like this, what you just want to do is make sure, if you need help, swap out the colors that he has to the same colors, like two reds. A red Aboriginal dot, a red Roman glass, and a red spot. And if they're all basically the same colors as what you're swapping out, you can still follow those patterns if you need help. Okay, once you have your squares laid out, this is very important. You're going to align them inside the dotted dashed lines. You're going to make sure your interface grid is, the glue part is facing up, and you put the wrong side down inside the blocks. You must take the time to square these up with each other, and you just slightly want them to overlap or touch. You do not want that big of a gap. You want to make sure they're square and they're touching. You're going to then take, once you get this laid out, so this is half, right, and you've lined this up, you do not have to press the whole thing. You can just start in a section, and you'll want to use a pressing cloth because you don't want this extra interface glue to get on your iron. Use a pressing cloth and press them down. Don't iron them back and forth because they'll move on you. So press, and then lift and press all of these little babies in place. You will not want to move them or try to peel them off if you get them misaligned. You're going to have to be really careful when you peel them apart, and maybe even clip them and sew them together at that point, because this little interface is fragile and it will tear. So you might want to press them lightly first, make sure that they're good, and then press them down again. If you intend to move them at all, you just slightly press them to hold them, and then check it, and then press them down really good to keep them in place. So now that you have these pieces and there's no gap between them, then what you're going to do is you're going to fold over this line, and you're going to sew your lines, okay? And you're going to sew horizontally all of your lines, and then you're going to bend them and clip them, because then you're going to fold them this other way. And I sew every other line first. I find that's easier. And then I come back and I sew the opposite skipped lines. It's just easier when you're folding them the first time to have that sewn that way, and I showed that in depth on the other webinar. Okay, so I have an example too that I can show you next week. Tonight is just about learning the basic technique, but this week, you know, your homework, if you want to go that far and start sewing, you can. There's a blog reference for members of the Petting Fabric. Go to the menu where it says member content and go down to the collage technique webinar, and there's a whole blog about this there. So I have pictures as well. So but this week what I want you to do is lay out your sample, the sample that I sent you. You do not have to cut your case fabrics for this quilt and use it in the sample. You can use your sample that I sent you to see if this is a technique you want to do, and you can use any scraps that you want to make a panel. So once you make your panel and you like this technique, and then you can cut your kit and you can go with this technique as a whole. If you don't want to do it this way, you can follow the pattern if you don't use those fabrics cut in 2.5-inch squares for this particular technique. So hold off and try, before you start cutting, try out the technique on the sample panels, okay? All right, let's talk about designs. So one of the coolest things about laying these fabrics out is the design of your quilt. And in this particular Bright Squares, right, it all has this diamond effect, which is super cool. Obviously, you know you can make really cool heart shapes in the big part of your quilt like Tula does. You can make almost any shape you want with your fabrics. But what you need to really focus on is alternating spots and prints, and spots and prints. So in this example, I have a spot, an Aboriginal dot. I have two different colorways of spots: Aboriginal dot, spot, Aboriginal dot, spot, Roman glass, spot. So you do want to repeat the same color depth. So here I have the sherbet spot, and then I have this beautiful orange Aboriginal dot out here. So it, complements each other, and it pulls your eye and your color all the way out, okay? I did repeat two fabrics in here, which is the white with a black spot, which I love, one of my favorites, but only just a little. I don't do big, long sections that are a repeat. And then you need some grounding pieces. You need some really dark pieces that will ground it. And when I mean dark, it doesn't have to be black. It just has to be deep in color and rich. And you want that somewhere in this print to help kind of make that pop and, explode in really cool ways along your print, okay? So this is, a really easy way to lay out your colors and figure that out. And then if you want, you can take a photo before you press it down and put it on the group and share it with us and get 100 opinions. Even though you may not want 100 opinions, we're happy to share our opinions with you guys. So that's kind of the homework, and the session for this week is to grab your sample panels, find some fabrics that you might want to play with to make this. It's a great panel. It's a big piece. So you could even make a little throw with your sample and put a border on it, and it would be a great lap quilt. So test this out. Cut your strips. You can cut them in 2.5-inch strips. Use a jelly roll, almost anything that you want. And then start laying out your prints, and then it's just press and sew the seams. So next week, what we're going to do is I'm going to actually have some of these sewn. If you're going to go ahead and sew them, you need to watch my other webinar. So I'm not going to get through the horizontal and vertical sewing techniques and how you bend them and clip them without cutting through until next week. This week is just about planning and organizing and laying out your fabrics and then pressing them down and testing this little grid feature. And then next week we'll talk about how to implement that.